So your fifth installment of the Beatles is their fifth album, Help. And in the opening montage, you heard a clip from You're Gonna Lose That Girl. And now you're going to hear a clip from Ticket to Ride. All right, so that was Ticket to Ride, and you might have noticed that the early soundings of heavy metal in that song, as John Lennon said that was the first heavy metal ever recorded on an album. So the Beatles invented heavy metal, John. So I bet, there you go.
He and I are going to disagree on that.
Where was that sound? Because I didn't hear it.
Oh, it's in there. You just got to,
right next to the saw.
Smokes, yeah, that was it was next to the saw. So this album comes in at it's actually number 38 now on the best ever albums, best 100 albums of the 60s. It was ranked number 5 in the year of 1965 and 239 of all time. As I said, it was their fifth studio album and their fifth album that we've covered. So, after this, when we cover any Beatles albums, we're really getting into full-blown mid-period and late-period Beatles. The album was recorded from February through June of 1965, and it was released on August 6th, 1965. And it's also a soundtrack to the film of the same name. So this is 2 albums in a row that we've covered by the Beatles that were also released as feature films. And we can talk a little bit about that in a second. So 7 of the 14 songs on this record appear in the film. And like Hard Day's Night, those songs are all found on the first side of the album. Most of them were written by Lennon, a couple by Paul McCartney, and one by George Harrison. And the album actually has 2 covers, which are on the second side. And it really represents the last Beatles record that has any covers included, with the exception of their final album, Let It Be, which does have a cover in there. So the U.S. version of the record actually is very different than this version, the UK version, because the second side only included orchestral music from the film. It didn't include any of the music that you hear here. It's basically the score of the film. And like I said, it includes 2 Harrison songs, which is I Need You and You Like Me Too Much. And those are the first Harrison songs you see on a Beatles record since his initial song Don't Bother Me from the second album with the Beatles. So this album, it probably, I would say, starts really as the beginning of the mid-period of the Beatles. It's the transition from the early Beatles to the mid-period, and it really sees the band expanding their experimentation with really focusing on multi-tracking, which is essentially a system that allows for separate recordings of multiple sounds or sound sources recorded at different times to create like a cohesive whole piece. It also incorporated the use of strings, primarily on the standout track Yesterday, which is one of probably, if not the most famous Beatles song, which is on the second side of this album. And this was the first album, rock and roll album, that was ever nominated for a Grammy for Album of the Year in 1966. I found this stat interesting. So the cover of the album, if you're familiar with it, shows the Beatles kind of lined up and holding their hands in different positions, kind of looking like they're trying to actually spell out the word help with their arms. Mm-hmm. So this idea actually came from the photographer, Robert Freeman, who took that photo, who said that he had the idea of having the band spelling out letters in what they call flag semaphore. Mm-hmm. I don't know if either of you have heard of that. I had never heard of that before, but essentially that's a system that conveys information at a distance by means of visual signals with handheld flags, rods, discs, paddles, or occasionally bare or gloved hands. And so this was a way to convey information, with the positioning of flags, and each different arm position represents a different letter. So the photographer had the idea that the band should, spell out help. But when he had them do it, he realized, well, that doesn't really look so good. The letters of HELP didn't really have the aesthetic, effect that he was going for. So he changed it around to make it look like they were actually spelling out help. So on the UK release, the position of the arms actually spell out NUJV, and on the US version, it's NVUJ. And so neither one of those are even remotely close to spelling out help. But aesthetically, I guess it looks better. So I found that interesting because I had no idea about that prior to researching this.
I didn't know that either.
Oh. So the reviews at the time were pretty positive. There was a reviewer that actually said it's typical Beatles material and offers very few surprises. But then who wants surprises from the Beatles? And while that, some people thought that was true, McCartney took exception to that type of review because, he viewed that, he and his bandmates really believed that artists should continually develop and, change their work. And while it's not a huge departure from earlier stuff, there certainly is different things that they're doing here that's a much more mature sound. I think that you're getting with the earlier records. They are experimenting a little bit, but it's not like to the degree that you will see with the albums that followed this. Mm-hmm. So in early 1965, also around this time, George Harrison and John Lennon were slipped some LSD in their tea by George Harrison's dentist. They were hanging out at a party with Harrison's dentist, a guy by the name of John
Classic.
Riley. And they're hanging out there with their lady friends, and the dentist just dropped some acid in their tea, unbeknownst to the Beatles. And then there was some party some club that they ended up going to, and the story was that the elevator opened up and Harrison's like everything was on fire and he freaked out. So even though it was a little bit of a bad trip, Lennon later said it was just terrifying, but it was also fantastic. I was pretty stunned for a month or two. He and Harrison became Lennon and Harrison became regular users of the drug, and later on Ringo followed. And McCartney was the last one to join in, but he finally did in the latter part of the year. And another stat here or fact was that even though they had to took a while to get McCartney to actually agree to take the drug, he was the first one that admitted to in a interview and kind of called everybody out for doing the drug, and that was something that rubbed Harrison and Lennon in particular the wrong way. So
it's exactly how I would imagine that would have played out, isn't it?
Pretty much. And other notable incidents around this time, in June of 1965, Queen Elizabeth II appointed the Beatles as members of the Order of the British Empire, which was typically an award that went to military veterans and civic leaders, and many were offended that this honor was given to a pop band. And some of the past recipients actually returned their insignias in protest that the Beatles were given this award. Rumor has
imagine that presentation, very formal British people scoffing and throwing back their medals. Yeah,
pretty much. I mean, and the Beatles, they graciously accepted, but they also kind of felt it was a little bit of a joke. And they tell a story too in the anthology movie about how they snuck away to the bathroom to smoke a joint, right before they were given the award. So so a little bit about the film. The film was released in July of 1965, and it was part of it was inspired by the Bond films, James Bond films. It was
I definitely see that.
Yep. So they were kind of going for a spoof on that. They were given a larger budget with this film compared to Hard Day's Night, but that's also because of the success of A Hard Day's Night. So that allowed for things such as the ability to film in color, and then shooting in various locations in the film, including in Austria when they're skiing, and in the Bahamas, which is the final scenes of the movie. And this is actually an interesting Beatle fact. This is where George Harrison is first introduced into the sitar. When they go to the Middle Eastern restaurant, and there's the band there playing Hard Day's Night on the sitars and the Indian music and Indian instruments, and that's where George Harrison first sees the sitar, and he later on, actually in their next album, Rubber Soul, is when he first uses it in Norwegian wood. Another inspiration that I came across, Josh, I've never heard of this, but it was partially inspired by the Marx Brothers film Duck Soup.
Yeah, classic Marx Brothers.
So. Yeah, I'm not familiar with them, I guess, but so that was part of the inspiration as well. And the original title of the film was 8 Arms to Hold You, and later they changed it to Help. John,
wasn't there a Veruca Salt album?
There you go,
8
exactly.
Arms to Hold You? Yes.
And that was where that title came from, was the original title of the Help movie. That was an homage from Veruca Salt to the Beatles.
You like that random pull right there? As you were saying that, I'm like, is that a Veruca Salt album?
And I knew you know that because I knew we went to see them several years ago, and I know that
I am a Veruca Salt fan.
Yeah. Other titles that were considered for the film, George Harrison's idea of "Who's Been Sleeping in My Porridge." Okay,
I like the other one better. Yeah.
So the film had some mixed reviews. I think, in hindsight, I think you're going to find that Hard Day's Night holds up stronger than Help does in the minds of critics. But you're still finding a lot of that, the British humor. Same thing as Hard Day's Night. But this one actually has a plot. It's we can talk about in a second. But anyway, this is more about the album. We will start. I know how John feels about this because we've talked about this before. So we'll start with Josh. Josh, what are your thoughts on the Beatles? Help!
I like this album. I don't like it as much as Hard Day's Night. And that is because a lot of the songs I find are very forgettable. So we've got a lot of strong songs, obviously, and I think it finishes strong overall. But it seems this album, in contrast to Hard Day's Night, seems like a pastiche of a lot of other things, and it doesn't seem like they're right where they get to at Rubber Soul yet. And I see the experimentation that you reference with the incorporation of like the bongos and some solo acoustic stuff, and you still got Harrison and Ringo singing songs, although that's not necessarily experimentation. But with songs like Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which obviously is like a Chuck Berry, Little Richard type of homage, and I've Just Seen a Face, which I really like, but sounds like a Simon and Garfunkel song, to the point where I thought it was a cover at first because I didn't realize it was original.
It is,
and for some reason this album didn't excite me as much as A Hard Day's Night when listening to it. Even multiple times I listened to it. I do think there's some strong deep cuts on it. Like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. I think that's my favorite song off the album. And that song reminds me specifically of later songs like Norwegian Wood. I like Lennon just kind of does different things vocally on that song than in other songs. And it does, you've got the I've Just Seen a Face and Yesterday closing out the album with Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which I can kind of take or leave. But I guess the highs are high on this album, and then the other songs, like I can't even remember what I Need You or Another Girl sounds like. They just kind of bleed into the background, and I think they're kind of weak sauce ultimately. Beatles. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right. A little mixed review there. John, I know how you feel.
This is my favorite Beatles album. Yeah, you know that already. Yep, it's always been my favorite Beatles album. I think it's the perfect mix of sort of the joy and the fun of the early Beatles album, and I love how it portends what comes in Rubber Soul and Revolver quite a bit. I also think it's not burdened down by some tracks like some of the later Beatles albums are that aren't as strong. And I appreciate the experimentation in later Beatles albums, but I like all 14 tracks on this. I think this album's stuffed with great deep cuts. Josh referenced that a little bit, but I mean the big hits off this album are Help, Ticket to Ride, and Yesterday, all of which are great songs, and they're also all completely spaced out on the album. They're tracks 1, 7, and 13, and then in between, I love The Night Before. I think it's one of the better deep cut Beatles songs in terms of what the Beatles sound like when they sing, and that combination of how their voices and their musical parts sound. You're Gonna Lose That Girl, I've always loved. I don't know what it is, but the progression that leads into the chorus almost reminds me of girl groups, good girl group songs. I've Just Seen a Face is another great song with great lyrics, and it's got one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Ringo singing song, Act Naturally, in it as well, which is almost like tailor-made for Ringo in so many ways. Right? It sounds like he's singing about himself in some ways. Yeah. So I really love this album. Is it the most complicated Beatles album? No. Could I see why someone might like A Hard Day's Night better than this, like Josh does? Absolutely. But for me, I don't know. It's a fun album, but it's also a more serious album than the Beatles albums beforehand. And I really think that you can't understand the rest of the Beatles catalog until you hear Help. And I do think this is the first album that makes the Beatles in many ways. Like the big B Beatles, like in terms of their reputation.
Can you speak more about the seriousness? Because I didn't really get that listening.
Ticket to Ride, I think, is a really, really good love song in terms of just, it's sophisticated. It's not sort of the looseness of the earlier tracks, if that makes sense. Help is a pretty deep song. And if I remember correctly, John Lennon, that's one of his favorite songs he ever wrote.
It is. That's correct.
Yeah. And it's one of the few songs he would play as a solo artist from his time as the Beatles, because I think it was autobiographical, and he found it to be pretty dark as well, about where he was at, the headspace he was at during this. And so that's a much deeper cut than you think. I think Yesterday is a really sophisticated. I don't see the Beatles writing songs like Yesterday in the first 4 studio albums.
No, that's true.
So that's kind of, I guess, what I'm getting at. There's still a little like teenage love, young love stuff, but but you can see where they're headed from this.
Gotcha. Yeah. I guess that's kind of what I latched onto, is like, You're Gonna Lose That Girl is about, more dating teenage stuff, and maybe I just didn't pick up on the other stuff.
Yeah, yep. I think so far Best Ever Albums is getting the order right so far for with the Beatles. I would not place these any differently. I think this is my favorite Beatles album that we've done so far. It's a close second to, or close. Hard Day's Night is a close second to this, because I love that album as well. But this is an excellent album, and I didn't listen to this a ton. Partially because I know this album so well, partially because I had homework and other albums that we're covering. But I did think when I was listening to this, because I always kind of thought that this was more of I always considered this an early Beatles album, and listening to the early the albums that we did already, and then listening to this this is really a bridge, and I would probably say it's leaning a little bit more towards the mid-period Beatles. And I think that John's bringing up some, I agree with some of the themes in this. This is Lennon definitely trying to be more autobiographical. He, shortly before this record, that's where the Beatles met Dylan. And Dylan famously said, "You guys are great, but you're not really saying anything," and he kind of like gave them a little bit of a challenge. And this is part of, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is clearly Lennon admitting, saying, "I'm trying to be Bob Dylan here." Help is literally, he was exhausted from Beatlemania and the fame and all the stuff, and he was literally screaming for help. That's one of the reasons he liked it so much, was that he was going nuts. And actually, he initially wrote that song and had it at a lower tempo, like a slower song. And the advice that he was getting was like, this really needs to be a faster tempo. And he did relent. But later on, he said, I actually kind of wish I didn't do that. Wish I kind of kept it at a slower pace, which I had never really heard of that before. But you're getting much more sophistication here. Ticket to Ride is a phenomenal song, and it really shows them experimenting. I mean, you've got Ringo. The drums are like, switching time signatures, between the verses and the chorus. You've got, you really do have, and I know Lennon says it's the first heavy metal record, and it's clearly not heavy metal, at least as heavy metal would become, but you see where he kind of says that in the sense of they're just strumming on that one note that's much louder and heavier than what a lot of other pop, songs were doing at the time. And that's just a great song. It's got a really lot of interesting things going on. There's country on here, Act Naturally, and what do you call? I've Just Seen a Face. It's like, those are the Beatles do great country songs. When you look back at what they did before with I'll Cry Instead, or I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. I mean, those are some of my favorite deeper cut Beatles songs. Interesting about those two songs, Act Naturally was written by a dude named Johnny Russell, and it was originally a Buck Owens song, the famous country artist Buck Owens. And in 1989, Ringo and Buck Owens teamed up to do a re-recording of the song, and I listened to it today, and it's terrible because it's a very 80s like Nashville country produced song, and this version's way better. But I found it amusing that they teamed up to do a duet with Act Naturally. And I've Just Seen a Face was written by Paul McCartney when he and John Lennon were still in a band called the Quarrymen. He wrote that years prior to this. So it's an interesting thing because I never knew that before. But I love how fast that song goes, how the lines just weave in and out, and it just goes and goes. And that's actually the first recorded Beatles song that was ever strictly acoustic. There's no bass track, no drums. It's just acoustic guitar. So there's a lot of firsts in this. We haven't even talked about, Yesterday yet, which is obviously that's
monumental.
Really that's like a solo song. They actually, there was a debate whether that should be released as a Paul McCartney song, and Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, was fiercely opposed to that, saying no way, the Beatles are a unit, they have to stay together, it's a Lennon-McCartney song. And George Martin the producer tried to figure out different things that they could do with it, but he basically said, I don't think we can do anything more than this and just add some strings. So he did the orchestration behind it. But that was a song that McCartney dreamt. The famous story is that he had a dream and that melody was in his head, and when he woke up he went straight to the piano and played it out and did a rough recording of it. And then for a month, he could have sworn, he's like, I think I plagiarized this. I must have heard this somewhere. And he played it for a bunch of people, and nobody recognized it as anything. So he put some words to it that initially were titled Scrambled Eggs, was the original title of the song. But that's mainly because it was just they had enough syllables to fill out the song itself. But that song is actually, we've talked about it before, it's one of, if not the most covered song of all time. There's over 2,200 covers that were recorded of it, and it's been performed by like over 7 million times or something. I don't know where they're getting these stats or who's counting how many times people are performing Yesterday. But I think the only song on here that I'm a little on is Dizzy Miss Lizzy. That's the other cover along with Act Naturally. And it's only because I think that guitar part, the it's over and over again, and I'm like kind of sick of it. But the saving grace with that song for me is Lennon's voice. I mean, that's like a borderline twist and shout level vocals that Lennon's doing with his screaming. And I love that Lennon, when he's doing stuff like that. But it's just a really good album, and they're trying to do that. There's some experimentation. You got John playing a type of electric piano called the Horner Pianet. There's the Rickenbacker guitars is prominent in many of these songs. And you've got they're just trying to do a little bit more experimentation. So I love this record. I don't love it as much as John does. I would probably put this in the middle pack of my, if I'm ranking all the Beatles album, this is probably in the middle. But this is a classic Beatles record for me. And it's also highly recommended, I would say.
Nice.
Can't disagree with anything you said, Matt.
There we go. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, I Need You. I think, Josh, you might have mentioned that. George wrote that about Patty Boyd. We talked about her last week or 2 weeks ago, I think. That was George's first wife, and I guess there was a period where they broke up, and so he wrote that song about like, dude, I need you, So that was about her.
Got her back.
Yeah, and he did. He got her back. And I think I'm trying to think.
Well, he was in the Beatles, Matt. So yeah,
he was. Yeah, but he wasn't Eric Clapton though.
Yes. That's fair.
This is the other one. It's Only Love, which was a Lennon song on the second side. Lennon was very critical of that song later on, saying it was a lousy song with abysmal lyrics.
He wrote it too, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Yeah,
and
which is rare. He usually does. He loves his songs.
I didn't like
normally.
that song either. So with Lennon on that,
I like the song, and I never even thought about the lyrics because I never do. But I saw what he was saying. It's like, the lyrics aren't that great. It's pretty straightforward, and for a dude that's trying to be Bob Dylan, that's clearly not Bob Dylan level stuff. But yeah, he did. He's got a couple of songs like that, Lennon does, where he goes back and he's like, I hated that song, but usually the songs that he hates I like, so, whatever. But yeah.
There was something that came up recently where it was mentioned, because Patty Boyd was both, all the stuff with Clapton that's recently come up. And she admitted that, I think this was in the past, but she admitted that she liked being with George more than Eric Clapton. She said she had more fun with George than Eric Clapton.
George just seems cool, doesn't he? Oh, that's what I wanted to ask you. Josh, what'd you think of the movie?
Oh, it was pretty hilarious. It's so... They definitely take it up a notch in the new one, in Help, because the slapstick is out of control. They're running all over the place. Things are happening. It's like a cartoon. They live in this crazy house that is completely ridiculous and really funny. And when they have to, like, the neighbors are waving to them, and they're like, be polite to the and I mean the kind of the cultural stuff with the British people acting like some middle Indian cult or group or whatever doesn't age well, but
no, it doesn't.
There's a lot of
there's a little racist undertones there. Yeah,
there's a lot of funny moments, and Ringo's got some great facial expressions too when things happen to him. So he's trying to get the ring off and everything.
He's probably the best actor, I would say.
I would agree.
I
always feel that way. Yep.
He seems to work with the camera best, and the other guys try and kind of like fade into the background and stuff, but he's more
even that song Act Naturally seems to be about that, I think, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've always liked that. That was the first one that I saw, the movie, that, and I liked that better as a kid because I'm like, well, it's got a plot, because it's actually a story. Ringo's got the ring, and he needs to be, there's a cult that needs to sacrifice him and stuff, and yeah, there is a little bit of that, those racist undertones, but it's still funny, man. Like they're still pretty entertaining films.
It was hilarious too when they were playing the song and they they used like a chainsaw to cut around him, and he falls through on the drums. That was really funny.
The other thing to note about that is like they were smoking a tremendous amount of weed during the filming of that movie, like to the point where they were saying if we had to record something or film something in the afternoon, it was like forget about it, right? Like you needed to get us in the morning before we were totally blazed out of our minds. But like there's that scene where they're playing curling in the and right before it explodes they run away. Well, Ringo tells a story about how they kept running, like him and Paul. He's like, we ran forever just so we could smoke another joint, before shooting the next scene. So so that was always the you always know there's pretty much every scene in there they're just blazed out of their minds, So
that would be that's a good way to do that movie, I think, probably.
When Josh eventually does his accompaniment music movies to go with this, Help will be one of the earliest categories, I think, or entries.
Well, there's one more thing I wanted to say about that, because I forgot. I found this quote that George Harrison said there, because the Beatles with Yesterday, going back to that song, they specifically said we don't want that to be a single because it was totally not their image. It's not something that they wanted to do. So it actually wasn't released as a single in the UK until like 1976 for some reason. Wow. But it was trying the patience of the other band members to the point where George was saying, he summed it up when he said, "Blimey, he's always he's talking about McCartney. Blimey, he's always talking about that song. You think he was Beethoven or somebody, because McCartney was just always like trying to play it, trying to figure out the chords on the set of the film, to the point where the director was like, dude, would you stop and get over here so we can film this? So I guess McCartney was really took a while to work that out, but it made the Beatles frustrated. But great album. I love it. I guess I see what you're saying, Josh. I don't know, but I'm so biased that I don't, I don't know. I would just say listen to it more because I think it's great.
Maybe so. I think I enjoyed the movie more than the album in some respects.
Wow.
I'll be interested after we cover Rubber Soul and Revolver, Josh, to see what your take is on it, because I think as a companion piece, I think you might find that it. I don't want to say that sounds kind of airy. I think it might click a little bit in terms of
the progression.
That's how, and that's because that's the first period of the Beatles I really listened to, and it was so clear, as Matt said, that it's a middle Beatles album and not an early Beatles album.
Yeah,
to me at least. Yeah.
And Josh, you didn't really know much of this stuff before this week?
No, I knew Help, just not. I mean, none. A lot of it doesn't stick in my memory. Okay. For whatever reason. But I do like Rubber Soul and Revolver a lot, and I know those albums better than this one, I think.